If you'll pardon the autobiographical slant of this video, I promise that it's not just an excuse to talk about myself. Rather, I've noticed something in my own speaking of foreign languages that is of use to you, the viewer, if you are learning a foreign language or if simply you are interested in any foreign language, and specifically in the Romance languages. So I've been spending the last few months of my life between Italy and Spain, and I've noticed a very interesting difference in how I am perceived as a foreign language speaker. In Spain, most people have assumed that I am either Spanish, or if they've noticed that something might be slightly off about my Spanish, they assume I'm English. And this, to me, makes a lot of sense. Spanish is the foreign language I'm most comfortable with. But at the same time, English is still my first language, and so there's bound to be some degree of language transfer. So for Spain, so far, so predictable. But it's in Italy where things get a bit weird. And it started off as an anomaly that I simply discounted, but over time became so frequent as to be statistically significant, to an alarming degree, a degree that I would not have ever been able to explain up until a few weeks ago. Italians think that I'm French. When a friend commented that she initially thought that I was French, I asked her why, and she responded with something very interesting. She said, "Well, you speak Italian with a French accent." And I think there's actually a solid linguistic reason why. The moment when I started putting together a potential reason for this strange misperception is when I watched a short by the language YouTuber Nardi. Now, if you are somehow watching this video and you aren't subscribed to and haven't heard of Nardi beforehand, correct that injustice and go and subscribe to his channel. He is a formally trained linguist. All of his shorts are extremely well researched, and they provide a fascinating insight into how languages work and into etymology and features of linguistics in general that surely will be of interest to you if you are watching what we produce on this channel. Now, in particular, Nardi had a short about how French lacks lexical stress. What this essentially means is that French words don't have stress per se. If pronounced in isolation, they don't bear stress. In fact, rather, French distributes its stress sentence-wide. In general, French sentences have stress on the ultimate syllable of every sentence. For example, if I want to say I'm going to the university in French, I would say je vais à la faculté. But if I change that final word to institution, it would be je vais à la institution. You can see that the stress in both instances is on the final syllable. If I take the initial example and I actually shorten it from faculté to the more common fac, I would still say je vais à la fac. And you can see that the emphasis is still on the final syllable of the sentence. And this kind of flies in the face of what you might assume. French has a reputation for being extremely difficult to pronounce. We'll get back to exactly why in a moment. For now, I want to jump across to Spanish and make a brief comparison. Unlike French, Spanish does have lexical stress. That is to say, words in isolation possess their own stress patterns. But fortunately with Spanish, stress is very regular. Stress almost always in Spanish, about 70 to 75% of cases, falls on the penultimate syllable, the second to last syllable. Words like casa, hablan, comemos, libros, all of them have stress emphasis on the penultimate syllable. In the cases that don't conform to that, most of the time, stress we find on the final syllable of the word. Instances like cantar, reloj, papel, or amor come to mind. For all the exceptions to those two norms, it's very clearly indicated with the Spanish acute accent where we ought to put the stress. An example like this would be the word for tree. Árbol has an acento agudo on top of the vowel. Combine this with the fact that Spanish has a very simple pentavocalic system in which each vowel only has one sound. Once you memorize and can faithfully reproduce the vowel sounds and the consonant sounds in Spanish, speaking the language convincingly is not that complicated, but not so with Italian. And this is where we get back to my testimony. You see, Italian, like Spanish, does have lexical stress. And in most textbooks, when you're being introduced to the language, it will be explained to you that Italian tends to have stress on the penultimate syllable. But that's a dramatic oversimplification. In fact, in Italian, there are so many exceptions to this penultimate stress rule that, in my experience, Italian stress almost has to be memorized word group by word group. Let me give you a few examples. It's certainly true that words like pianta, finestra, parlare all have stress on the penultimate syllable, but look at these interesting exceptions. Many Italian words have stress on the final syllable. Usually, this is fortunately indicated in cases like città, università, perché, virtù. But what about instances where the peculiar stress isn't marked? Telefono, medico, tavolo, fragile, difficile, utile. None of those have stress on the antepenultimate syllable, and in none of those instances is that stress marked. Something that I struggle with still to this day often are the verb forms that carry irregular stress usually in the third person conjugations. Things like parlano, scrivono, dormono, devono. And this extends even to the imperfect tense. For example, parlavano. Don't even get me started on a lot of the vocabulary that's been adopted from Greek and has its own and defies the laws of regular penultimate stress. For example, analisi, sintesi, ipotesi, crisi. In addition to that, of course, Italian has the phenomenon of consonant gemination. And when we have these double consonants, this raddoppiamento confuses the heck out of me. Usually, this gemination indicates that the vowel immediately preceding the double consonant is shortened and the vowel afterwards is lengthened. So, for example, we don't have ottenere, but ottennere. We don't have, as seen before, difficile, but difficile. Take all of these exceptions that I've indicated and combine them with the fact that Italian has a much greater degree of tonal dynamics in speech relative to Spanish. Spanish comes across as considerably more monotone when spoken, whereas Italian has this rising and falling intonation that is natural to any Italian speaker, but is very difficult to replicate if you did not grow up with that language around you. Combining all of this information and going back to my own personal experience, I want to offer the following ipotesi. When I speak Italian, my ear has a hard time figuring out where I need to place the stress. Is this word regular? Does this word have regular penultimate stress? Or is this part of that plurality of exceptions that I've outlined above? Now, when reciting a text, this isn't usually difficult because I have time to think about the words. But when speaking in conversation, even in a relatively slow conversation, it's difficult to replicate the correct stress patterns. And so, my assumption is that what I tend to do is speak Italian with almost French levels of monotony, maybe with an occasional emphasis towards the end of the sentence. This is why that friend of mine said that I speak Italian with a French accent. But I think that doesn't even explain the full story, because I've noticed there's another enormous challenge. And it goes back to the very nature of the Italian language. Historically, it's well known that Italian, as we speak it, is rather a learned, standardized form that comes as a consequence of the period of the Risorgimento, the formation of Italy as a modern state. Now, what this means is that while every educated Italian can speak and understand standard Italian, there is often accent and stress transferal from local dialects. I've spent a lot of time in the Veneto region, and speakers of Italian in the Veneto region have a very peculiar, particular tendency to lengthen the penultimate syllables in their speech. A normal buongiorno in the Veneto region might come across more like buongiorno, come stai? I apologize to any Veneto speaker if I've misrepresented your accent. But this is just one example of how influence from local dialects and languages affect how Italians speak standard Italian. And this means that if you come to the country as a non-native Italian speaker, not only do you need to try get your ear used to how standard Italian stress patterns work, you also have to sift that out from the multitude of dialects that you are being exposed to on a daily basis, from students, colleagues, or visitors from other parts of Italy. So, I'm going to finish this off by asking what you think. Is my analysis, my self-diagnosis on point here, or maybe I'm missing something very important? As usual, if I've made any mistakes with the linguistics of this video, please let me know in the comments and I will pin the most cogent correction so that everyone can see it. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. And for now, adieu, au revoir, and adios.